In the glittering darkness of 1950s Hollywood, where dreams were manufactured under Klieg lights and secrets festered in the shadows, two stars collided in a passion that would nearly destroy one of them. This is the story of Marlon Brando and Rita Moreno, a love affair so intoxicating, so devastating, that it would take 8 years and a near-fatal overdose before it finally released its grip. The year was 1954. Marlon Brando was already a god. At just 30 years old, he'd revolutionized American acting with his raw, animalistic presence in a streetcar named Desire. He was the man every woman wanted and every man wanted to be. His sexuality radiated off the screen like heat from summer asphalt. He was dangerous. He was brilliant. He was damaged. Rita Moreno was 22, a Puerto Rican firecracker who'd been dancing and acting since childhood, desperate to prove she was more than Hollywood's idea of a Latin Spitfire. She'd been typecast in role after demeaning role: Island Girl Number 3, Polynesian Beauty, Native Princess. Always the exotic ornament, never the leading lady. She was hungry for recognition, hungry for respect, and about to become hungry for a man who would feed her nothing but crumbs. They met at a party. Of course they did. That's where all the best disasters begin in Hollywood. The details of that first encounter are hazy, lost to time and trauma, but what's certain is the electricity that crackled between them. Brando saw in Rita something he recognized in himself: ambition wrapped in vulnerability, talent trapped behind the bars of other people's prejudices. And Rita saw in Brando everything she thought she wanted: genius, power, and a dark charisma that promised to consume her whole. The attraction was immediate and overwhelming. When Brando looked at you, really looked at you, it felt like he could see straight through to your bones. Rita didn't stand a chance. Here was this young woman, still finding her footing in an industry that saw her as nothing more than a sultry accent and dark eyes. And suddenly the most electrifying actor in the world wanted her. How do you say no to the sun, even when you know it will burn you? But there was a problem. Actually, there were many problems, but the biggest one wore the face of 1950s America. Brando was white. Rita was Puerto Rican. And in the carefully calibrated world of Hollywood publicity, where images were everything and reality was whatever the studio heads decided it should be, this simply would not do. Brando's career was skyrocketing. He was being groomed as the ultimate leading man, the rebel with sex appeal, the thinking woman's heartthrob. His handlers, his studio, his carefully constructed public image, none of it had room for a Puerto Rican girlfriend. The romantic leading men of Hollywood were supposed to date Marilyn Monroe types: blonde, white, unthreatening. Rita, with her fierce intelligence and undeniable ethnicity, didn't fit the template. So Brando made a choice. He would have Rita, but he would have her in the shadows. And Rita, drunk on love and desperate to be chosen by someone who seemed to see past her Hollywood-assigned identity, agreed to be hidden. She didn't realize she was signing a contract written in her own blood. The shadow relationship began. For 8 years, 8 years, Rita Moreno would be Marlon Brando's secret. She would be the woman he called late at night, the woman he made love to with an intensity that felt like salvation, the woman he whispered promises to in the dark. But she would not be the woman on his arm at premieres. She would not be the woman he introduced to his famous friends. She would not be acknowledged, celebrated, or claimed. The cruelty of it was exquisite in its casual brutality. Brando would invite Rita to parties, his parties, parties where she should have been welcomed, celebrated even. And then he would ignore her. He would spend the evening with blonde actresses, flirting openly, his hand on their waists, his attention focused anywhere but on Rita. She would stand in corners, drink in hand, watching the man she loved perform his desire for women who looked nothing like her. Imagine that torture. Imagine loving someone who makes you invisible in rooms full of people. Imagine the special kind of hell that is watching your lover's hands on another woman's body while you're standing 10 feet away, expected to smile, expected to understand, expected to wait your turn for whatever scraps of affection he might toss your way later that night. But Rita stayed, because the moments when he did see her, when he did choose her, felt like oxygen after drowning. Brando had a gift for making you feel like the only person in the world when he wanted to. And then, just as quickly, he could make you feel like you didn't exist at all. The infidelity wasn't even secret. Brando didn't bother hiding his other women from Rita. Why would he? She'd already accepted the fundamental premise that she wasn't enough, that she wasn't the right kind of woman to be publicly claimed. His affairs weren't betrayals in his mind. They were simply the natural order of things. He was Marlon Brando. The world was his buffet, and he intended to sample everything. There were so many women. Actresses, waitresses, strangers he met on the street. Brando collected women like some men collect stamps, with a completionist dedication and a collector's detachment. And each new woman was a knife in Rita's heart, a fresh reminder that she was not chosen, not special, not enough. But here's the truly diabolical part. Brando was smart enough to keep her hooked. Just when Rita would reach her breaking point, just when she'd gather the courage to leave, he would reel her back in. A passionate declaration, a tender moment, a glimpse of the man she fell in love with, the one who seemed to understand her soul. He played her like a virtuoso plays an instrument, knowing exactly which strings to pluck to get the sound he wanted. This was emotional manipulation at a masterclass level. Brando didn't just want Rita's body. He wanted her total surrender. He wanted her to accept his terms, to recalibrate her sense of self-worth to match his valuation of her. And slowly, painfully, she did. Rita began to shrink. The vibrant, ambitious young actress who'd fought her way through Hollywood's racism and sexism started to believe that maybe she deserved this treatment. Maybe she wasn't worthy of public love. Maybe being Brando's secret was the best she could hope for. The psychological damage was profound and insidious, like carbon monoxide poisoning. Invisible, odorless, deadly. She stopped fighting for better roles. She stopped demanding respect. All her energy, all her fire, was consumed by the black hole of Brando's need. And he didn't need her, in his way. He needed someone who would accept his darkness, who would love him despite, or perhaps because of, his cruelty. Rita became the repository for all the parts of himself he couldn't show the world. Years passed like this. 1954 became 1955, became 1956, 1957, 1958. Rita watched herself age in the mirror, watched opportunities pass by, watched other actresses, white actresses, get the roles she should have had. And through it all, she remained tethered to Brando by chains she'd helped him forge. Friends tried to intervene. They saw what was happening, saw Rita disappearing into the shape of Brando's desires. But she couldn't hear them. When you're drowning, sometimes you cling harder to the anchor, not understanding that it's the thing pulling you down. The control extended beyond just the public humiliation and infidelity. Brando had a way of making Rita feel like she was losing her mind. He would promise to meet her, then not show up for days. He would tell her he loved her, then introduce her to his latest conquest, as if Rita meant nothing. He would be tender and vulnerable one moment, cold and dismissive the next. This wasn't just carelessness. This was psychological warfare, whether Brando fully understood what he was doing or not. Rita's friends watched her transform from a confident young actress into a woman who jumped every time the phone rang, who organized her entire life around Brando's whims, who had internalized the message that she was lucky to receive even his cruelest attentions. She developed that particular haunted look that comes from loving someone who uses love as a weapon. And Brando? He seemed to thrive on the chaos. He was working through his own demons, his own complicated relationship with intimacy and power. His father had been abusive, his childhood traumatic. But understanding the roots of cruelty doesn't make the cruelty hurt less. Rita was bleeding out, and Brando's wounds were not an excuse for the ones he inflicted. By 1961, 7 years into this toxic dance, Rita was barely recognizable. She'd won acclaim for her work. She was talented, undeniably so. But her personal life was a crater. Everything revolved around Brando. When would he call? When would he want her? When would he discard her again? The breaking point came, as breaking points often do, on an ordinary night that turned extraordinary through accumulated pain. The details are Rita's own, told years later when she'd finally found the courage and distance to speak about what happened. But the essence is this: she couldn't take it anymore. Imagine 8 years of being someone's secret. 8 years of watching the man you love parade other women in public while you waited in the dark. 8 years of being good enough to sleep with, but not good enough to acknowledge. 8 years of feeling your self-worth erode like coastline in a storm, piece by piece, until you can't remember what you looked like before the erosion began. Rita Moreno, in Marlon Brando's home, surrounded by evidence of a life she was never going to be part of, made a decision. If she couldn't live with the pain, she would end it. She took an overdose of sleeping pills. This wasn't a cry for help. This was a woman who had reached the absolute limit of what a human heart can endure and found that limit exceeded. She wanted the pain to stop, and she couldn't see any other way to make it stop. Brando had become her entire world, and that world was uninhabitable. She swallowed the pills, one after another, each one a tiny white escape hatched from the unbearable present. And then she waited for the darkness to come and make everything quiet. But Brando found her. Picture that scene. The man who had spent 8 years treating Rita as disposable suddenly faced with the very real possibility of her permanent disposal. Did he panic? Did he feel guilt? Did he, for one crystalline moment, understand the magnitude of the damage he'd inflicted? He got her to the hospital. She survived. Her stomach was pumped. Her life was saved. And she woke up to face another day in a world that suddenly looked very different. Because here's what a suicide attempt does. It clarifies. When you've been willing to die to escape your life, you can't pretend anymore. You can't tell yourself it's not that bad. You can't minimize or rationalize or hope things will get better. You've crossed a threshold, and there's no going back to comfortable delusions. Rita, in that hospital bed, had to confront the truth. Marlon Brando was killing her. Not quickly, not obviously, but surely. Loving him was incompatible with her survival. And she had to choose. For the first time in 8 years, she chose herself. The ending of the affair wasn't dramatic in the Hollywood sense. No screaming scenes, no thrown objects, no grand confrontations. It was quieter than that, and somehow sadder. Rita simply walked away. She gathered what was left of herself, and she left. Brando, according to Rita's later accounts, was confused. He couldn't understand why she was leaving. After all, nothing had really changed, had it? He was still the same man he'd always been. But that was precisely the problem. He'd never hidden who he was. Rita had just finally seen it clearly. The aftermath was long and painful. You don't recover from 8 years of psychological abuse overnight. Rita had to learn how to be a person again, how to have boundaries, how to believe she deserved better than scraps and shadows. She had to rebuild her sense of self from rubble. She went to therapy. She worked on her career with renewed focus. She dated other men, though trust came hard now. Brando had done damage that would take years to repair, scars that would never fully fade. And what of Brando? He moved on, as he always did. There were other women, other affairs, other people to consume and discard. He married multiple times, had many children, continued to be Marlon Brando, brilliant, troubled, and destructive in his intimacies. But Rita carried the scars forever. In interviews decades later, after she'd won her Oscar, after she'd had a successful career and a stable marriage, she would still talk about those 8 years with Brando. The pain was still there, faded but not gone, like an old injury that aches when the weather changes. She described him as the love of her life and her greatest torment in the same breath. She talked about the racism that made her collaboration in her own invisibility possible, how she'd internalized the message that she wasn't good enough to be loved publicly by a white man, that she should be grateful for whatever private attention he deigned to give her. This is the real tragedy of the Brando Moreno affair. It wasn't just about one man's cruelty and one woman's suffering. It was about how Hollywood's racism and the culture's beauty standards created the conditions for that suffering. Rita was kept in the shadows because the industry in the 1950s had no room for interracial relationships in its fantasy narratives. Brando exploited that, but he didn't create it. Rita Moreno survived Marlon Brando. She went on to become one of the few performers to win an Oscar, an Emmy, a Tony, and a Grammy. She became an icon, an advocate, a symbol of resilience. But she paid a terrible price for the privilege of loving Marlon Brando. But in interviews decades later, you could still hear it in her voice when she spoke about him. The complicated mixture of love and hatred, desire and disgust, gratitude for what she learned about herself, and rage at what it cost her to learn it. She would describe him as both the love of her life and her greatest mistake, which is how traumatic love always feels, true and terrible at the same time. Brando never publicly acknowledged the relationship. Not really. Not in any way that gave Rita the recognition she'd craved for 8 years. Even in his memoir, published decades later, she was a footnote, a passing mention, easily overlooked. He continued to be Marlon Brando, genius and monster, icon and cautionary tale, until he died in 2004, alone and enormous and haunted. This is the story Hollywood doesn't like to tell. We prefer our legends gilded, our icons unsullied by the messy reality of the damage they inflicted on real people. We want Brando the actor, the revolutionary, the rebel. We don't want Brando the man who emotionally tortured a woman for 8 years because he could, because she let him, because something in him needed to destroy the things he loved. And Rita Moreno? She became a survivor, an activist, a woman who used her pain to fuel her art and her advocacy. But she shouldn't have had to survive Marlon Brando. She should have been able to simply love him, be loved by him, and move on. Instead, she got 8 years of psychological warfare disguised as romance, and a suicide attempt that she's had to carry with her for the rest of her life. The affair between Marlon Brando and Rita Moreno is more than Hollywood gossip. It's a story about power and race, about who gets to be public and who has to stay hidden, about the particular kind of violence that looks like love until you're lying on a bathroom floor realizing it's been killing you all along. In the glittering darkness of 1950s Hollywood, two stars collided. One of them emerged bigger and brighter than ever. The other barely survived the impact. That's not romance. That's not passion. That's what happens when genius meets vulnerability and decides to feed. This is the secret Hollywood tried to keep. This is the price Rita Moreno paid for loving a god who turned out to be all too human. This is what 8 years in the shadows looks like when the lights finally come on.